Hello and welcome everyone to today's Applying Ethology webinar. Before we start with an introduction to today's speaker, I would like to remind everyone to our housekeeping rules. The first one is that please be aware that your camera and your microphone are switched off, so we can have a smooth and a non-disrupted talk by the speaker. If you have any questions regarding to the talk that you would like to ask the speaker, feel free to put them in the chat function, and the moderator of today's session will ask these questions at the end of the talk. With that, I would like to introduce our today's speaker, Alina Schaffer. She's a PhD student from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Psychology, Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and she's also hosted by the University of Leipzig. In her thesis, she aims to identify socio-ecological factors that can explain variation in cognitive traits in different ungulate species. And I assume what she's presenting today is going to be a form of an appetizer of what she's going to do in the thesis later. So today's we will hear her research on gaze following in a variety of ungulate species. Alina, the screen is yours, please.
Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. So hello everyone, my name is Alina Schaffer, and today I will tell you something about gaze following in ungulates. So first, what is gaze following? Gaze following is a very basic form of social cognition, and it's defined as the ability of looking where others are looking. Gaze following allows individuals to socially acquire relevant information about the environment, and for example, about the food location or the presence of predators, and also the occurrence of social interactions among group members, and of course also about the interests and goals of others. Gaze following is highly adaptive for humans and also other animals, and it has been reported in a variety of taxa like dogs, birds, reptiles, and also several primate species. When we're talking about gaze following, we need to differentiate a high level and a low level form, and they're also defined as gaze following into space and geometrical gaze following. But what does this mean now? So the low-level form is defined as an innate response that's triggered by a shift in the individual's attention toward an external target. This sounds very complicated, but it isn't. It simply means when a conspecific turns the head, the individual's attention is caught by this movement, and then the individual will simply look in the same direction. It's very basic, and so no cognitive skills are involved. The high-level form is considered as the ability to take others' perspective and thus understand what others see from their location. So if an individual sees a conspecific looking in another direction, it might use the conspecific's gaze as a cue to obtain information about the environment. And this might also lead to moving around a barrier to gain the conspecific's perspective. And also gaze following appears to be widespread across taxa. Some studies have shown that this behavior can differentiate between closely related species. And this may be, the reasons may be, and the species can differ in two ways. So firstly, they can differ in their general sensitivity to gaze following. So some species may reliably follow others' gaze, while others might less reliably do so. And there might also be some species that completely avoid direct gaze and also gaze following. On the other hand, species can differ in the ability to follow the gaze of individuals of other species. So the gaze of a conspecific might provide relevant information for an individual, and so the individual will benefit from it. Allospecifics might not do so and thus less likely trigger gaze following behavior. The reasons for this are yet unknown or unclear, but It might, on the one hand, simply depend on the differences in the motivation and or the interest in certain models. And some researchers also said that domestication can play a role there. So on the one hand, domestication might reduce the sensitivity to predators because humans protect domesticated animals against predators. And so gaze following might be less frequent in domesticated species if the main function is to get information about the presence of predators. On the other hand, domestication might have selected for especially tame and socially skilled individuals, which have enhanced social skills and thus also better gaze following skills. The effect of domestication is yet unclear. Some studies have suggested that domestication has an effect, others didn't find an effect. And so we need more comparative studies to better understand which factors best predict the interspecific variation in gaze following. So in our study, we aim to compare species and their ability to follow the gaze of conspecifics and allospecifics and the effect of domestication on these skills. But why did we pick ungulates? We used them for two main reasons. So firstly, ungulates are a still largely understudied taxon, and to our knowledge, only one species has yet been tested for the gaze following skills, which are goats. And testing these species can increase the range of species on which we have information, and thus help to shed light on the selective pressures that might affect the emergence of gaze following skills in different taxa. And secondly, ungulates include a variety of domesticated and non-domesticated species, and they show an impressive variety of socio-ecological characteristics. So ungulates constitute an ideal model to contrast different evolutionary hypotheses on the emergence of gaze following skills. So we tested 17 goats and 3 llamas, which are both domesticated species, and 4 mouflons and 4 guanacos, which are non-domesticated species. Llamas and guanacos are phylogenetically closely related, and so are goats and mouflons. And llamas have been domesticated about 5,000 to 3,800 years ago, while goats have been domesticated around 10,000 years ago. Our study subjects included both males and females, and except for the goats, all animals were adults, and for the goats, we had also 4 infants. So what were we doing? We administered 2 tasks, one using as a model a conspecific and one a human experimenter. And for the conspecific task, we waited for 2 individuals facing each other. And one of them was giving his back to the experimenter, which was the subject. And one had the experimenter in his visual field, which was the model. Then the experimenter tried to catch the model's attention, for example, by holding a piece of food in the air. Then by this caught of attention, and the model would move his head towards the experimenter and thus in another direction. And this was done while the subject still looks at the model. And then a trial was started when the model moved the head, and yes, and the subject still looks at the model. Then a trial was scored successful if the subject turned the head in the same direction in which the model looked at. And for the controls, the task was identical, except that we had no model. And the trial was started when the subject was giving his back to the experimenter, so that no gaze cue was provided. The human task, we waited until an individual, in this case a subject, looked at the experimenter, which was the model, and then the model suddenly raised his or her head toward a distant upper corner of the enclosure, so either on the right or on the left side, and then a trial was started. In this case, a trial was scored successful if the subject turned the head towards the same upper corner in which the model looked at. And for the control condition, it was identical, except that the model looked at the body of the subject. So here's a short overview of our results. First, I only show you the goats to give a better overview of the colors. So in black, you can see the experimental conditions. With the lines, it's the control condition. And in light gray, you can see the human task, and with the lines, again, the control condition. So if we now look at the results for all species, we can see that all species follow the gaze of both the human and the conspecific, even though they did better in the conspecific task, and they all did better in the experimental than in the control condition, except for the guanacos. But I will give you some more details about our results now. So firstly, our study provides the first evidence of gaze-following skills in non-domesticated ungulates. And while all species followed the model's gaze more in the experimental than in the control condition, the non-domesticated guanacos failed to significantly do so. And in line with our predictions, ungulates followed the model's gaze both with the human and the conspecific model, but they were more likely to do so when the model belonged to the same species. So some more details, what this might tell us now. So the main finding of our research is that gaze-following skills are present in ungulates, even in non-domesticated species. And this is also in line with previous studies in other taxa, which have already shown that non-domesticated species can reliably follow others' gaze, sometimes even better than their domesticated counterparts. And our study provides no support to the hypothesis that domesticated species show different gaze-following skills than non-domesticated ones. Domesticated species do not seem to have an advantage over non-domesticated species, which would have been expected if the close coevolution with humans during domestication had selected for socially skilled individuals. But also the non-domesticated species do not seem to outperform the domesticated ones, which would have been expected if the gaze-following skills were less adaptive in a domesticated species, which receive an extensive protection from predators by humans. And also, gaze-following appears to be really widespread across taxa, even in the simple forms. So then also, in contrast to the non-domesticated mufflons, the non-domesticated guanacos fail to reliably follow the model's gaze and show the same probability of gaze following in both the experimental and the control conditions. And these results may be mainly due to the low performance of the guanacos when they were tested with the human model, because there they showed a higher proportion of successful trials in the control rather than in the experimental condition. At the moment, it's not possible to understand why the guanacos performed worse than the other species, especially with the allospecific models. Possible reasons, therefore, might be that guanacos show more selective attention toward their conspecifics, but it's also possible that the results depend on the small sample size we had, as we could only test 4 guanacos, and therefore larger sample size might have provided different results. But it's also important to note that other species in our study showed evidence of gaze-following skills, even though we also had their small sample sizes, for example, for the llamas, where we could only test 3 individuals. So even while the inclusion of more study subjects might show that guanacos can follow the gaze of humans and conspecifics, our study already provides evidence that domestication is no necessary prerequisite for the emergence of gaze-following skills in ungulates. And the last point is, while it's true that guanacos performed especially poorly when they were tested with human models, all species performed significantly worse when they were tested with humans rather than with the conspecifics. And this seems to confirm that the animals generally have more interest or motivation to follow the gaze of conspecifics, as this can more likely provide relevant information. Now, these findings have important implications for the study of interactions between humans and other animals, because on the one side, they suggest that there's an astonishing ability of most animal species to use human gaze in the same way as the conspecific gaze, but it also shows that there are some limits in this ability even in the domesticated species. Then we also tested the effect of sex, age, and the trial number, but couldn't find an effect. And it's important to note that development in ungulates is very quick. And so to detect an effect of age, one should include very young individuals, which we did not have for our study. Also, our results are in line with previous studies that suggest that gaze-following skills emerge early on through development. And we could also show that the performance did not increase through time. And so this suggests that the individual response were not a result of a learning process during the study. Then our study must be considered as a first attempt to study gaze-following skills in ungulates. And from a cognitive point of view, further research is needed to understand the psychological underpinnings of gaze-following skills in different species. So on the one hand, we need further conditions to be able to better understand whether ungulate species show a high or a low level form of gaze following. Then future studies should also include more individuals and species to have more power to better control for inter-individual differences, and also to test other evolutionary hypotheses on the emergence of gaze following skills. And at least in the future, it will be especially important to also test other non-domesticated species, because the ancestors of guanacos and muflons have been domesticated, so into llamas and sheep. And so it's still possible that gaze-following skills in these species are linked to the favorable pre-adaptive characteristics that were possessed by the ancestors, and which might have then favored their domestication and also the emergence of social cognitive skills like gaze following. So after all, our study confirms that ungulates are a promising taxon to study comparative cognition, and that host animals are ideal subjects to extend the range of tested species, also including those that have long been neglected in cognitive research. But in the end, it's important. So why should we study the cognitive traits when we're talking about improving the welfare of animals? So we all know that we have a lot of animals living in captivity and that we're using factory farming. And we also know that welfare is strongly associated with psychology. So if we're able to understand the cognitive traits, sorry, we will also be able to understand the psychology of the animals better. Then we should improve the welfare by improving the enclosures through enrichment programs to distract the animals from their boring daily life, because being boring can also lead to psychological problems. And the animals are all bored, I think, in captivity, because they get lost of all their natural tasks, like searching for food, which needs a lot of time in their natural habitats. And we also need to find better and more appropriate housing conditions and living conditions. Then it's also important that people are aware of animal feelings. And I think it was last week that Great Britain recognized the feelings in vertebrates and enshrined this in law. And I think this is a very important first step in the right direction. And I hope that a lot of others will follow them, because it's very important that we understand how the animals understand things. And so we can't expect too much from them, but to keep it in a right direction. Then we also need to improve our handling with the animals, because this will lead to less stress, and less stress leads to a better welfare. And it's also important that we better understand the animals with whom we interact and with whom we live together in our daily lives. So it's important that we understand how much do they understand, how they see the world, and maybe this is similar to humans. And also we need to find more effective ways of communication, education, and management. And for example, with a dog, I think everybody, maybe most people who don't have a dog, think, oh, a dog, very nice, I'd like to pet him, and mostly on the head. But a lot of dogs don't like this. Also the one in the picture who shows a lot of stress sickness. And it's important that people learn how animals are communicating, and that we are aware of that when we're living with them together, or use them in our lives. And the last point is we need to have realistic expectations, and also meet the ones of the animals. So I want to thank my co-authors, and who did a great job, and also the staff of the zoos, which supported us a lot, and also to the leaders of the special issue, which we could be part of. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Alina, for the great talk. If anyone from the audience has any questions regarding the results or the methodology or the discussion, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I just go first before we, so we can wait for more questions to pop up. I was wondering also when I was reading the paper, what were the exact limitation that you ended up with 3 individuals, or I think 3 or 4 individuals from some of the species that you've tested? So were there only so few individuals in the enclosures? And if not, what led to the exclusion of the other individuals? And I was wondering whether your statistical model was also including as a factor the domestication level, yes or no, instead of just the species level, because you mentioned that the guanos did not follow the gaze. I was wondering whether, if you compare domestic to undomestic or non-domestic ones, whether there might be also differences in their gaze following behavior.
Okay, so to your first question, the number of other individuals we tested was so low because there were only less individuals in the zoos, so in the enclosures we had, and due to the corona crisis we weren't able to test more species in other zoos. And yes, we also tested if their domestication had an effect, but in our study we couldn't find a difference.
Okay. Okay. I just realized again when I was reading the paper the first time that I would have definitely expected, at least when it comes to, well, following the gaze of the human, to find a species difference from our own experience, how, for example, wild goats or domestic goats react to humans. I would not have expected wild goats or wild ungulates to follow the human gaze in the same way as domestic ones do. There's still no questions in the chat. Sorry for being so we wait for a question in the chat, for being picky on their methods. I was realizing that there was a picture of you looking at the goat, or the goat was looking at you. And I'm not sure whether this was part of the experimental setting or was a picture that you've taken just because the goat was close to you. Because I remember the setup for the human gaze following looked a bit different, with the experimenter standing outside of the enclosure. Mm-hmm. So with a larger distance between the subject and the human. And I was wondering whether this was the case for all species, or whether you tested the goats because it was I'm not sure whether it was a petting zoo enclosure. You tested them inside the enclosure and the other species outdoors, if there was any difference on that.
Yes, it's exactly this. Goats were in a petting zoo, so we could go into the enclosure, but we tried also to stay about 2 meters away from them, so to keep also the distance a bit far, so it's more similar to the other species where we couldn't enter the enclosures.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. Aline is asking whether you can unpack a little more information about the comparisons that have been made among ungulates and dogs. I assume in the respective ability to communicate or interact with humans.
Okay, I think there's a difference because most of the ungulates we're having in the factory farming. I think that's the it's a place where people have the most contact with them. So, and it's a bit different with dogs who are living together with us. And of course, dogs are known for their high sociality, and that they even more interact with us, also compared to wolves. So if we say the dogs are the domesticated ones, we know that they do more communicate with humans than the wild ones do. But I think it's also an important point because of the factory farming, where a lot of ungulates are held, and but it's also at the zoo. So we also need to communicate with them. I think if we use them for us, we should also know more about them, and also be able to to give them less stress as possible. And so we also need to understand how they communicate with each other. And I don't know if this matches the question.
Thanks. I think the answer fit the question indeed. Yes. There are no more questions in the chat. Yeah, that's okay. From Alina. I was wondering, in terms of gaze following, whether you were with goats or ungulates in particular, having the eyes positioned on the in a bilateral way, and not in a frontal way like we would see with dogs or for humans. Would this give them a disadvantage when we would say we would like to compare dogs and goats in the same paradigm with the same setting, that the eye position alone, the anatomy alone would give them a disadvantage because they just see way more than, or they have a wider visual field than other species, for example, dogs would have. So there sometimes might not be the need to follow the gaze of others because they might have spotted it already. So there might not be this strong reflex to show this behavior. What do you think?
I think this may be true, but on the other side, there are no predators. And so I think it's even more important that they have a wider sight. So even if a conspecific at the edge of their of the field where they can see reacts to something, it's even more important that they can see this to fly it. And I think that's maybe more an advantage in this way because they even more depend on this, because the earlier they detect a predator, for example, the more highest the chance that they can survive.
Yeah, that's completely right. So this, though any disadvantage from their anatomy is probably outdone by the need to spot predators. That's right. So there's a question from Laura. Great presentation, Alina. You mentioned that you see this type of research can be used to help us understand the behaviors and signals animals are sharing with us so that we have better interactions with them. What do you dream future studies will look like, and how you will share your gaze following research with animal caretakers to improve human-animal interactions?
Okay, that's a good question. I think it's important to include more species with which we really interact. So I think it's important. So for research, it's important to include as much species as possible, of course. But I think the first step, maybe we use most of the animals, for example, we have in the factory farmings, because I think the more we as a scientist can say that, or the more we understand about these animals, the more we can help to improve their welfare. Because I think the more science can show they understand those things, or they have feelings, like in Great Britain, where they now finally insurance is in law. And I think it's important that researchers so focus maybe first on those species, because even so they in the zoo might not have the best living conditions. I think for the ones in factory farming, it's even worse. And I think it's so important that we change something there.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. No, I think I can completely agree on that. That in particular, when we look for very specific examples where these specific results could be applied, it's hard for basic research to find ground with the results. So there needs to be a more holistic way to implement these results, I guess, in management and husbandry of farm animals or zoo animals. There are two more questions, one from Kate, one from Andrea. Kate is asking, what species do you think should be tested next? And do you think the original reason for domestication could influence the ability to gaze follow?
Yeah, maybe it's similar to what I said right now. I think that the next species should be also ones we have in the factory farming. And
yeah, I'm not sure what the second part is exactly referring to, whether you think the original reason for domestication could influence the ability to gaze follow, or
okay.
whether
I think maybe it's because the reasons why we domesticated species is because, so I think I'm not completely sure, so sorry if this is wrong, because we wanted to use the animals so for food, or for example, sheep for their wool. And so I think not that this may be the reasons that really influence, or that this really influenced the gaze-following skills, but I think that humans concentrated on animals that are very tame and that are easier to handle, and so maybe those animals also learn to interact more with humans than maybe non-domesticated species or species that don't have any contact to humans. Yeah, but I'm not sure if this has an influence on the gaze-following skills with conspecifics.
Thanks for the answer. I think Andrea's question is adding smoothly to this context as well. Nice talk. Any chance that you will collect more data on home-living goats, pigs, or similar ungulate species? Are you planning something like this? Just because, as you also said, already said, pet dogs clearly experience us in a different way.
Okay. I'm not planning things like this, but I think it's a very nice idea. To be sure, or to be honest, didn't have already. But it would be very interesting, I think, to compare them with the same ones in the zoos, or yes, maybe the wild counterparts.
Okay, thanks for your answer. I don't see any more questions popping up yet. Yeah, I think we can conclude the webinar for today. Alina, thank you again for this great presentation. I think we've learned a lot about domestic and non-domestic ungulate species and their cognitive abilities. Thanks for this nice overview on these cognitive features in general, and thanks to everyone who watched for attending today's webinar. So I'm saying goodbye, and hopefully we'll see every one of you in the next webinars as well.